A shy girl named Emma Reed didn't believe in fate. She believed in keeping her head down, working hard, and surviving the day without drawing attention. But on a sweltering Tuesday morning, as she stopped to adjust her shirt in the reflection of a dark car window, she had no idea that someone was watching her from the other side of the glass, someone who would change everything she thought she knew about herself, and about the kind of life she deserved. Emma Reed walked with her head slightly down, as if the weight of her past was sewn into her shoulders. The morning sun had already begun to rise high, casting long shadows of street signs and flickering off parked cars. Her jeans were worn thin at the knees, and the faded tank top clung awkwardly to her frame in the early summer heat. She wasn't going anywhere special, just on her way to the diner where she worked the morning shift, but even for that, she wanted to at least look somewhat presentable. She paused on the sidewalk when she saw the sleek black car parked at the corner. It was spotless, a luxury model she couldn't name, the kind of car that didn't belong in this neighborhood. But it had dark windows, almost like a mirror, and she instinctively stepped closer to fix the strap of her tank top that kept slipping down. Her reflection stared back at her, messy ponytail, faint circles under her eyes, no makeup. She pressed her fingers to her shirt, adjusted it, and for a brief moment, looked into her own eyes. Then she turned and kept walking. What she didn't see was the man sitting inside the car, just beyond the tinted glass. Edward Montgomery hadn't moved. He had been parked there for a while, engine off, his phone face down on the seat beside him. He had no business being here, no scheduled meeting, no real reason to drive through this part of the city. But something about being away from the marble floors and glass elevators of his world made him feel like he could breathe. That morning, he had parked without thinking, just trying to clear his head. And then she appeared. He noticed how she didn't look around to see who was in the car. She didn't pose. She didn't try to look beautiful. She didn't even seem to know how beautiful she was. There was a quiet honesty in the way she stared at her own reflection, almost like she didn't recognize herself. That vulnerability did something to him. He had seen women dressed in diamonds and silk, women who knew exactly how to get his attention. But this girl with second-hand jeans and tired eyes, held his gaze without even trying. By the time Emma disappeared down the street and out of sight, Edward was still sitting motionless, lost in a thought he couldn't name yet. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know why she mattered. But something inside him shifted. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel numb. Emma's world was built on routine. She woke up at 5:30, made a pot of cheap coffee, tied her hair back without looking in the mirror, and walked the same cracked sidewalk to the diner 6 blocks down. The building was old, the sign missing a few letters, and the smell of burnt toast seemed to linger even after closing. But it was her job, and more than that, it was the only stable thing she had. She had been working there for almost 2 years, ever since she aged out of the last foster home. It wasn't glamorous. She wiped down sticky booths, refilled chipped mugs with watery coffee, and kept her mouth shut when customers called her "sweetheart" like it was her name. Most nights, after her shift, she took the bus across town to a cramped community college where she was slowly, painfully, working toward a nursing degree. Some nights she fell asleep on the bus and missed her stop. Some nights she sat through class with aching feet and an empty stomach. But she kept going. Not because she believed in happy endings, but because doing nothing was worse. Her past clung to her like a second skin. Her mother had died of an overdose when Emma was 13, right there on the floor of the one-bedroom apartment they shared with 2 other families. The memory of calling for help, her hands shaking so hard she could barely dial, still lived in the corners of her mind. After that came the system, foster homes, temporary shelters, counselors who asked too many questions, and foster parents who wanted the paycheck more than the child. Trust was not something Emma gave easily. In fact, she didn't give it at all. That's why, when she noticed the same black car passing the diner twice in one morning, her stomach turned. At first, she thought it was coincidence. Some rich guy got lost. Maybe a business meeting nearby. But when she caught the same sleek car again later that afternoon, parked across the street while she took the trash out back, her instincts sharpened. She knew what it felt like to be watched, even if she didn't understand why someone would be watching her now. She didn't say anything to anyone at the diner. She never did. She just tightened her ponytail, pulled her hoodie tighter around her frame, and told herself to stay alert. Her world didn't allow for fairy tales or strange encounters that ended well. In her experience, people didn't just appear in your life unless they wanted something. And no one ever wanted something without a cost. So she kept her eyes down, her step steady, and her heart locked away where no one could reach it. Even if someone was watching, even if something was about to change, Emma had learned long ago that hope was dangerous. It made you soft. And soft didn't survive. Edward had never been one to fixate on strangers. His life was built on efficiency, structure, and distraction, meetings that bled into more meetings, curated social circles, scheduled calls, and carefully managed appearances. But something about that girl, the way she looked into the car window like it was the only mirror she had carved a space in his mind that he couldn't ignore. He kept returning to that block, not every day at first, but enough to make himself wonder what the hell he was doing. He told his assistant he needed time away from the office, claimed he was researching investment opportunities in urban renewal projects, even though he didn't believe in lying. He just didn't want to explain what he couldn't understand himself. Every time he drove past that diner, he told himself it was curiosity. But deep down, he knew better. He wasn't watching the neighborhood. He was watching her. One afternoon, he sat parked down the block, the car engine humming softly. The windows were tinted enough to hide him, but not so dark that he couldn't see her through the glass. She stepped outside in her uniform, black pants, a plain shirt with a faded name tag, and dragged 2 heavy trash bags toward the alley behind the building. He noticed how she moved like she was used to doing everything herself, like no one had ever offered to help. There was something painfully ordinary about her, but in that ordinariness, he saw something extraordinary. She wasn't trying to be noticed, and that made her unforgettable. He asked his driver, Marcus, to find out who she was. Marcus didn't ask why. In their years together, Edward had never asked for anything like this, and the man understood instinctively that this wasn't business. The next day, Marcus handed him a small file with her name, her workplace, and a brief background check. Edward was surprised to learn how little there was. No known family. A few foster homes. A part-time student. Clean record. Quiet life. He could have sent someone to talk to her, arranged something indirect, but he didn't want to play games. That wasn't what this was. So instead, he walked into the diner. The first time, he sat in the back corner and ordered black coffee. She didn't even look at him. She refilled his cup, cleared his plate, wiped the table next to him without saying a word. And still, he stayed. He came back the next day. And the day after that. Always sitting at the same table. Always ordering the same coffee. He watched how she handled rude customers with calm silence, how she offered quiet kindness to the elderly man who came in every Wednesday, how she moved with the careful presence of someone used to being invisible. By the 4th visit, he found himself waiting for her to glance at him, to acknowledge him in some small way. But she never did. And oddly, that only drew him closer. She wasn't impressed. She wasn't curious. She didn't care who he was or why he kept showing up. What he didn't know was that Emma had noticed him the very first time he walked through the door. She noticed everything. She just didn't react. Reacting meant opening the door, and she didn't open doors for anyone. Not anymore. She had no idea who he was, but something about him made her uneasy. He was too calm, too clean, too out of place. And yet, there was something familiar in the way he looked at her, like he was searching for something he'd already lost. Neither of them knew it yet, but something irreversible had already begun. On the 5th day, Emma couldn't take it anymore. The same man, the same table, the same quiet stares, it was starting to gnaw at her. She wasn't easily spooked, not after everything she'd lived through, but this was different. He wasn't creepy, he wasn't pushy, he wasn't doing anything wrong. And maybe that was what made it worse. He was just there. Always watching, never speaking. She approached his table with the coffee pot in hand, refilling his half-empty cup without asking. Her voice was flat, but her eyes were sharp when she finally broke the silence. "Did you lose something here?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. "You've been sitting in that same spot for 5 days straight." The man looked up at her slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, but his eyes didn't match the smile. There was something heavy in them, something quiet and searching. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe I found it." Emma rolled her eyes and turned to walk away, but something about the way he said it, soft, sincere, not flirtatious, made her hesitate. She glanced over her shoulder, almost against her will. He didn't try to follow her or say anything else. He just sipped his coffee and looked back out the window like he was waiting for something he couldn't name. Later that day, when she stepped outside for her 10-minute break, she found him leaning against the wall near the diner's entrance. He had no coffee, no phone, no agenda. Just his hands in his pockets and that same quiet expression. "I'm not here to bother you," he said before she could speak. I like talking to you." Even if it was only one sentence. Emma folded her arms across her chest. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "But I'd like to." She shook her head, more amused than annoyed now. "That line probably works better in whatever part of town you're from." "I didn't mean it as a line." His voice was steady, unpolished. "I meant it exactly the way I said it." She studied him for a long second, unsure if he was insane or just stubborn. He didn't look like a liar. He didn't look like anything, really, just a man who somehow didn't fit his own face. "Look," he said, stepping back. "No pressure. No games. Just, if you ever feel like getting some air, I know a place nearby that serves better coffee than this one." She arched an eyebrow. "You've been drinking this coffee all week." He smiled, this time with something real behind it. "Exactly." That night, she didn't go with him. But she thought about it. And the next day, when he showed up again and simply nodded at her without expectation, she felt a strange flutter in her chest that she hadn't felt in years, something close to curiosity. By the third time he asked, she said yes. Not because she trusted him, not because she wanted anything from him, but because something inside her whispered that maybe, just maybe, not every door led to pain. Some doors just led to fresh air. Their first walk was quiet. Not the kind of awkward silence that begged to be filled, but something more natural, like two people sharing space without needing to explain why. They strolled through a park just a few blocks away from the diner, where the trees leaned low over the cracked paths and the benches were faded from years of sun and rain. Emma didn't speak much, and Edward didn't push. He seemed to understand instinctively that pressure would only drive her away. He walked beside her, hands in his pockets, occasionally glancing over as if to make sure she was still there, still real. When she finally spoke, it wasn't small talk. She asked him what he did for a living, and he hesitated. For a moment, he considered telling the truth, that he was the CEO of Montgomery Holdings, that he sat at the head of boardroom tables most people would never see. But something in her eyes made him take a different path. "I used to run a company," he said carefully. "Right now I'm trying to remember who I was before that." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Emma didn't seem surprised or curious. She just nodded, as if she understood what it meant to lose pieces of yourself along the way. Over the next couple of weeks, their walks became routine. They never planned them. He would stop by the diner after her shift, wait outside without saying a word, and if she felt like joining, she would. If not, he would simply nod and leave. That was the deal. No pressure. No questions. Just presence. During those walks, she started to open up. Not all at once, but slowly, piece by piece, like someone testing the weight of a locked box before handing over the key. She told him about the first night she spent in a foster home, how she had slept with her shoes on because she didn't know if she'd have to run. She told him how she used to read medical textbooks in the library because she couldn't afford internet or classes, how she once saved a neighbor from an overdose and that was the moment she realized she wanted to be a nurse. Her voice was calm when she said these things, like she'd learned long ago that pain had to be handled like glass, gently, or not at all. Edward listened more than he spoke. When he did talk, it wasn't about money or power or business. He talked about his brother, who had died in a car crash when they were teenagers, about how his parents stopped looking at each other after that, and how the silence in their mansion had been louder than any scream. He told her how success felt like climbing a mountain that never ended, how every accomplishment left him feeling more hollow, not less. And how she, this girl from nowhere, made him feel something solid under his feet for the first time in years. There was no romance in those first days, no touching or flirting. Just two people slowly unfolding their bruised histories under the dim light of street lamps and quiet skies. But something deeper was building, something rooted in truth, not fantasy. Emma didn't trust easily, and Edward didn't expect her to. But with every walk, every shared silence, every honest word, the walls she had built so carefully began to shift, just slightly. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered if it was possible to be seen, not as a burden, not as a project, but as herself. It happened on a Thursday evening, the air heavy with the promise of rain. They had walked farther than usual, ending up at a quiet overlook above the city where the lights blinked like distant stars. Emma sat on a low concrete wall, her hands curled around a paper cup of tea he had bought from a street vendor, and for the first time in weeks, she looked relaxed. Her shoulders weren't pulled up tight. Her eyes weren't scanning the horizon for threats. She looked at peace, or at least close to it. Edward had been thinking about this moment for days. The truth pressed against his ribs like a stone in his chest, and each time he looked at her, it grew heavier. He had told himself that he needed more time, that she wasn't ready to know, but deep down he knew that was a lie. The longer he kept it from her, the more it would feel like betrayal. So he took a breath and spoke, not with the confidence he usually carried, but with quiet vulnerability. "There's something I haven't told you," he said, watching the way her eyes sharpened in an instant. "Something important. About who I am." Emma didn't move, but her posture changed. Subtle. Defensive. She placed the cup beside her on the wall and crossed her arms, but she didn't interrupt. "My name is Edward Montgomery," he continued. "I own a company, Montgomery Holdings. It's big. Probably the kind of company you've heard of without knowing who runs it. And I didn't come to that diner by accident. I saw you one morning and I came back because I wanted to know who you were." The silence that followed was complete. Not a single breeze moved the leaves. Emma didn't speak, didn't blink. For a moment, he wondered if she was breathing at all. She finally stood up, slow and deliberate, and took 2 steps back from him. Her face didn't show anger, not yet, but there was something harder than anger in her eyes. Disappointment. Distance. "So this was all some kind of game?" she asked, her voice low and controlled. "You just decided to drop into my life because you were bored?" "No. Emma, it wasn't like that." "Don't," she snapped, and suddenly the calm was gone. "Don't say my name like you have the right to it." He tried to explain. He told her he didn't plan for any of it, that he hadn't expected to feel anything, that meeting her had changed him in ways he didn't have words for. But she wasn't listening anymore. She wasn't even looking at him. Her hands were shaking, not with rage, but with that old, familiar instinct, to run. "I let you in," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I don't do that. I don't let people in. I know. And I didn't want to lie." "But you did," she said, her voice flat now. You watched me. You found out who I was without asking. That's not honesty. That's control. He reached out, not to grab her, just to be closer, but she stepped back again, and the look on her face made his chest ache. I thought you were someone like me, she said. But you're just another rich guy playing with something you don't understand. And then she was gone. She didn't look back. She didn't give him a chance to follow. One moment, she was standing there with the city lights behind her. The next, all that remained was the paper cup still sitting on the wall, growing cold in the dark. For weeks, Emma disappeared. She didn't just stop answering texts or ignore his calls, she vanished. The number she'd used was disconnected. Her social media, what little there had been, was gone. She wasn't at the diner anymore, and when Edward asked the manager, all he got was a shrug and a quick, she quit. No forwarding address, no explanation. She had erased herself, and she had done it well. At first, Edward told himself to respect her decision. He had hurt her, even if unintentionally, and she had every right to walk away. But each morning he woke up hoping to see her name flash on his phone, and each night he stayed awake wondering where she was. It wasn't guilt that haunted him, it was absence. The silence she left behind echoed louder than any fight they could have had. He went back to the street where they'd first met, the cracked sidewalk and that old mirror-like car window that had started everything. He parked nearby, just sat there, wondering how a moment so small could have turned into something so massive. He found himself retracing their walks, standing at the corners they'd paused on, sitting on the bench where she once told him about saving her neighbor. He replayed her words in his head over and over, and the more he thought about them, the more he realized how much of her trust had been built on honesty, something he had violated without fully meaning to. He wanted to write her a letter. Not an email, not a text. Something slower, something real. So he did. He sat at the kitchen table in his penthouse, a place that had never felt more hollow, and wrote with a pen like he hadn't done in years. His handwriting was uneven, and the words didn't come easily, but he didn't stop until the page was filled. He didn't ask her to come back. He didn't make promises. He just told her the truth, everything he hadn't said when he had the chance. That he had watched her at first because he didn't understand what he was feeling. That he had lied by omission and regretted it every day since. That meeting her had been the only thing in his life that had felt unscripted and real, and even if she never forgave him, he would always carry the version of himself she had helped him discover. He mailed the letter to the one place he could think of, the rundown apartment complex across town where Marcus had once tracked her roommate's name. There was no guarantee she'd get it, no way to know if it would even reach her. But it was the only thread he had left. Days passed. Then a week. Then another. No reply. No sign. Then one evening, just as the sun began to slip beneath the skyline, Edward went back to the place where it all began, the spot on the sidewalk where she had once adjusted her tank top in the car's reflection, never knowing someone was watching. He sat on a nearby bench, hands folded, no expectations, just presence. She wasn't there. He stayed until the streetlights buzzed to life and the shadows grew long. He was about to leave when he heard soft footsteps behind him. He didn't turn right away. He didn't want to hope too soon. But then her voice came, quiet but steady. I got your letter. He stood slowly, heart hammering so hard it made his chest feel tight. She was there, a few feet away, wearing a hoodie pulled up around her face, like armor. Her eyes were unreadable, but she hadn't run. Not yet. I didn't know if I should come, she said. But I didn't want to disappear forever, either. He nodded. I'm glad you didn't. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then she stepped closer, just once, and it was enough. He didn't speak, didn't reach for her. He just waited, the same way he had when they first started walking side by side. And then, without another word, she sat down next to him on the bench, her arms tucked around her knees. For now, that was enough. A year later, the city looked different. Maybe it was the same cracked sidewalks and flickering streetlights, the same rusted fire escapes and distant sirens, but to Emma, everything felt lighter, as if the air itself had shifted. She walked down the same streets she used to dread with a steadiness in her step she never thought she'd have. Her scrubs were slightly wrinkled from a long shift at the clinic, but there was pride in the way she wore them. The name tag on her chest now read Emma Reed, RN, and every time she glanced at it, even by accident, a small part of her healed. The clinic sat on the corner of a block that had once been full of abandoned buildings and empty storefronts. Now, children played on the sidewalks while parents lingered nearby, some of them waiting for free checkups or just stopping by to talk. Inside, the walls were warm tones, not sterile white, and the staff called each other by first names. It wasn't just a clinic, it was a place built on second chances. Edward had sold a portion of Montgomery Holdings to fund the entire operation. It hadn't been a dramatic gesture or an attempt to prove anything. He'd done it because he believed in what she wanted to do, and because he no longer felt tethered to the idea that success meant skyscrapers and stock tickers. For the first time in his life, his wealth felt like a tool rather than a mask. Their relationship hadn't been a fairy tale. There were arguments, long nights of doubt, and days when silence hung between them like a question. But there was also growth, apologies that mattered, and the kind of trust that was earned in slow, deliberate layers. Emma still had her instincts, her wariness, but she no longer lived in survival mode. And Edward had learned how to listen, not just hear. They met each other where they were, not in perfection, but in progress. They never made a big announcement. There was no dramatic proposal or diamond ring in a velvet box. One night, curled up on the couch with takeout containers and a documentary playing in the background, Emma had looked over and said, "I'm not going anywhere, you know." He had smiled, leaned in, and whispered, "Good. Because I'd have followed you anywhere." Sometimes they walked past the place where she had once used his car window as a mirror. The building hadn't changed, but every time they passed it, Emma would glance at the spot and shake her head with a quiet laugh. "I was just fixing my shirt," she'd say, smiling at the absurdity of it all. "And I was just sitting there, avoiding my life," he'd reply. That mirror had better timing than either of us. They didn't need to pretend that everything had been easy. The beauty of their story wasn't in how perfect it was, but in how real it had become. They had come from opposite worlds, carried different wounds, and met in the most unexpected of ways. But somehow, against all odds, they had built something strong, something neither of them had ever dared to hope for. And sometimes, when Emma caught her reflection in a window now, she didn't see the girl who used to flinch from her own gaze. She saw someone steady, someone loved, someone who had finally come home. To me, the beauty of this ending lies in its quietness. It doesn't scream with fairy tale perfection or cinematic fireworks, and that's exactly why it feels real. Emma and Edward's story isn't about rescue, it's about recognition. Two people from wildly different worlds saw past surface and status, past fear and pride, and into the parts of each other that had been overlooked or wounded for too long. What makes the ending powerful is not that they ended up together, but how they did, through slow forgiveness, uncomfortable truths, and the terrifying act of choosing vulnerability after years of building walls. Emma didn't fall into luxury, and Edward didn't abandon his world. They both changed, not for each other, but because of each other. It's a love story, yes, but not the kind where everything is magically fixed. It's the kind where everything is faced. And in that, it becomes something far more lasting.